have a question for you today. Do you really know as much about slavery as you think you do? To test your knowledge, we'll be talking about the Atlantic slave trade. What was the Atlantic slave trade, you may ask? Well, in order to understand this complex method of trade, you first need to know what were the causes of African slavery. One of the causes was the high demand of cheap labor with the European colonists on farms and plantations. Really, slavery had existed for centuries before the big boom of African slavery. Islam spread in Africa, and with it, slavery in the country. Muslim leaders in Africa said that the slavery of non-Muslim prisoners was perfectly fine. It is easy for the Portuguese to bring in Africans as slaves for many different reasons. First of all, many Africans had already been exposed to the diseases the Europeans brought over. They brought an immunity to these diseases. This meant that it would be no different if an African caught something than if a European did. The Africans were less likely to make a successful escape due to two factors: not knowing the area well enough to leave, and the color of their skin made it impossible for them not to be spotted. Between the 16 and 1700s, English, French, and Dutch traders controlled half of the slave trade. This brings up our next question. How did slavery spread throughout the Americas? Between the 16 and 1700s, English, French, and Dutch traders controlled half of the slave trade. This brings up our next question. As European nations established colonies, their demands for cheap labor grew. England began to dominate the slave trade after its presence in the Americas grew. But as the slave trade became more prominent in Africa, some African rulers started to speak out against the practice. Still, the trade steadily grew, and this was due to the profits the African rulers would make. Eventually, African merchants who developed a whole new trade route just to avoid the rulers who wanted nothing to do with the slave trade. Let's get back into actual slave trade and what happened during this time. After their capture, millions of Africans were shipped to the Americas as part of a profitable trade network. The triangular trade, don't worry, we'll get to that soon. This brings up another question. When I mentioned the triangular trade, well, we're going to talk about that right now. The triangular trade was a transatlantic trading network named for its triangular shape and three routes. The first route sent goods to the west of Africa. After this, goods were traded for Africans. The final step was transporting the Africans and selling them in the West Indies. Merchants bought sugar, coffee, and tobacco in the West Indies and brought them to Europe. This letter is an example of how they treated the slaves. I was soon put down under the desk, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat. But soon, to my grief, two of the white men offered me edibles, and on my refusal to eat, one of them held me fast by my hands and laid me across the windlass, while the other flogged me severely. Aluda Equino. Okay, now that you know about the journey that Africans had to take, we can talk about the next part of the triangular trade. Slavery in the Americans. I'm sure you must be wondering how this whole situation happened, and if you aren't, I'll tell you anyway. Now I have another question for you guys. What was the Middle Passage? Well, this was the second part of the triangular trade route, sometimes considered to be the triangle's middle leg. The Middle Passage was the voyage that brought Africans to the West Indies in North and South America. Africans were put through a horrible experience when being shipped off to the Americas. Along with being transported to a whole new place against their will, they were not put under stable living conditions. Well, it happened. Africans were tightly packed into small parts of the ships, and it was in very uncomfortable positions. Sometimes people were laying over top of each other, and it was very crowded. They were beaten and treated poorly, and they were not fed or taken care of properly. Many died of diseases on the way, and others just jumped off the ship so they wouldn't have to consider the hardships of the trade. Out of all the Africans shipped from Africa to the Americas, only about 20% survived. Upon their arrival to the Americas, Africans were auctioned off to the highest bidder. After they were bought, slaves worked for their new owners in fields, mines, or as domestic slaves. They were still given little food and put through pretty bad living conditions and worked long and suffered through beatings and unpleasant circumstances. Slavery was lifelong and heritage. Although this could be looked at like a nightmare for Africans, and rightfully so, that Africans were able to develop a life in the Americas based on their own cultures, musical traders and stories were kept, as well as different celebrations that they were able to have. The Africans did rebel against their masters. They broke tolls on uprooted plants, worked inefficiently, and even attempted to run away. There was also some revolts. One in particular happened in 1522. 20 slaves in Hispaniola killed several Spanish colonists. Another was in South Carolina called the Stanyo Rebellion, which happened from 1739 and was similar to the revolt in 1522. Along with the revolts and unrest in Africans, there were more consequences faced. What were they, you might ask? Here are a few. In Africa, cultures lost many people to traders, like their young and aged men who worked, and the young women who could start families. Many families were torn apart due to this. Along with this, guns became introduced to Africa, and some African empires used guns to expand their territories. Some empires sold slaves to Europeans for wealth and power for more land. Along with revolts and unrest in Africans, there were more consequences faced. What were they, you may ask? Here are a few. In Africa, cultures lost many people to traders, like their young and able men who worked, and the young women who could start families. Many families were torn due to this. Along with this, guns became introduced to Africa, and some African empires used guns to expand their territories. Some empires sold slaves to Europeans for wealth and power for more land. Along with consequences, there were a few sort of good points. Many colonies like Haiti and Barbados proposed, and they owed it to the labor that contributed to the America. Expertise in agriculture also became prominent, and the farming industry grew. The Africans brought with them music, art, religion, and foods that were entirely foreign to the Europeans. To this day, many people in the Americas have many people with African descent, and they make up much of the population. So there you have it, the Atlantic slave trade in a nutshell. This should have expanded your knowledge on the triangular trade and what you think you know about the origins of African slavery in European colonies. Now you should be able to answer the very first question I asked. So do you really know as much about slavery as you think you do?